Okay, so for today we're going to look at this website called Canon Explains Exposure, where we're going to look at the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And those are the main functions when you're using a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera. You're changing those major settings: aperture, shutter speed, ISO, in order to get a good exposure. Where I'm going to say right now I'm using my phone. Phones are generally pretty good on auto making exposure correct for the environment, right? If I was to touch the background wall, you can see it just kind of changed darker. If I touch the foreground, it blew out the background now because it's trying to expose for the back of my computer, but I want to expose for the back wall. That's what it means. When you're touching the screen, you are changing the exposure for the part that you want to be in focus. Now, instead of just touching the screen, we're going to talk about what that means, because your phone is doing it digitally, right? So I'll do it one more time. I expose for the sticker on the back of my camera. Not touch it again. That black wall is starting to get blown out, right? Because the front of my camera is darker, so it's trying to increase the amount of light. If I touch the back wall, now you can start to see the lines in the brick, but the computer starts to get a little darker. We're going to figure out how to do that right now with a DSLR camera. And what is your phone actually doing to make those things work? Aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Aperture is a little circle dial kind of that opens and closes inside your camera, letting different amounts of light into the camera, right? It's literally opening up a hole saying, open up bigger, allow more light in, or close down and let less light in. But that will change the depth of field, how much is in focus in your pictures. If I have a large opening, this is going to let a ton of light in, but a narrow depth of field. That's like, and if you see it on the screen, where this picture is showing the foreground's blurry and the background is blurry, and just the plane is in focus, that's what a narrow depth of field means. So that's controlled by aperture. If I close down the aperture, let less light in to the camera, that's going to mean everything is going to be in focus. Everything, and if we're looking at this picture, from the back wall of the bedroom to those pencil crayons in the foreground, right? Let me just move the aperture dial, right? So if I move it way down, you can see here in the bottom, they give this example with chess pieces. The front chess piece is in focus, the back one is out of focus, and that would be a 2.8. f2.8, very large opening. If I go all the way to f22, and you can see here, this little red dial moved all the way to the end, every chess piece is in focus from the foreground to the background. But that would be a very small opening in the aperture. So it's a little bit confusing in that sense, where I have a small opening, but it's a big number, f22, and everything is in focus. If I open up the aperture, very large opening, but that's an f2.8 with a very narrow depth of field in your picture, okay? So when you're moving this dial, just look at the little thing down there in the lower right-hand corner to see if it's increasing the amount of depth of field or decreasing the depth of field. Shutter speed is the next thing. Shutter speed is literally, so now that I have this aperture, but there's a shutter in front of it. If I open up the shutter really fast, I'd be able to capture a fan moving, right? You can see here in the lower right-hand corner where if it is a very fast aperture, 1/4000th of a second, I'd be able to freeze a fan spinning. If I move it the other way, 1 second, and if you took a picture of a fan, you can see in the picture, it would just look blurry all the way around. Because you opened it up, the sensor was exposed for a second, so it recorded all of the movement within 1 second. Usually people like to do that with waterfalls, right? If I'm capturing water, if I take a long shutter speed, it will make the water seem like it's actually flowing, rather than a quick shutter speed of a waterfall, which freezes the waterfall in time, doesn't give the illusion of movement in a shutter. Same thing, imagine if a person was jumping through the air to catch something, you'd want a quick shutter speed to capture that image, rather than it just looking like a blurry image traveling through the air. So once again, different purposes have different settings. And then the last one is ISO. ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to light. So you have an aperture opening and closing to let light in. You have a shutter controlling how long the light is coming through. And then you have the ISO, the sensor, and how sensitive you want the sensor to be to light. ISO 100, best quality, but it is not as sensitive to light, but it's going to be the best quality. And you can see in the picture that black background is black. So to make it not grainy or what we call noisy in photography, you want to use a low ISO. If I move up the ISO, you can see now in the picture in the bottom, the black background has kind of become like a gray speckled, what we call noisy background. That's a high number for ISO. Reason why you would use that is if it's dark, right? So if you're ever trying to take a picture, say you're in the basement and you have your cell phone and you're trying to take a picture in the dark, it's kind of grainy. That's because the ISO is bumped up. It's trying to capture light in darkness, which it tries to do, but the ISO kind of is what you're looking to change for that situation. All right, so this is how the game actually works. You are going to try to recreate the picture shown on the screen by changing these three dials. So I can see in the background, it's blurry. The foreground is blurry, which means I have to have a low, because you can see with the chess pieces, that first one's in focus, the back one is out of focus, which means I will have a narrow depth of field, which is what this picture is showing me. An f2.8 is a narrow depth of field. For shutter speed, I want there to be some motion in the propeller, but I don't want there to be so much motion that the propeller just disappears because it's spinning. So I'm going to put it at about 1/180th of a second. I don't want to freeze the propeller, and I don't want it so blurry that it just becomes invisible. I want a little bit. At the bottom of the screen, you can see I've overexposed my picture. Right, this little dial right here, so I need to bring my ISO down. ISO 400 means I have good exposure, and I'm going to capture my image. There's the image I created, and it looks pretty much like the one that was on the screen. So, I've done it a couple times. Now, here's an example of what it would look like if it didn't work out. If I make my shutter speed 1 second, and I take the picture, you can literally, it's so overexposed, it's all white, except you can see kind of weird shapes around because I opened the shutter for literally 1 second, took in too much light. I won't go that extreme for this one. Let me go 1/4 of a second. That might not be bad. Let's go, can I get 1/8? Yeah, 1/8 of a second. Still overexposed. I'm opening the shutter too long, and I'm getting very bad exposed pictures. And you can see in my little dial, that little mark is way up by the 3, letting me know it's way overexposed, where if I move my shutter up to 1/180th of a second, now I have good exposure, and the picture turns out. So once you're feeling confident with moving these dials, I want you to take the challenge. You're going to push challenge, and I'm going to start the challenge. It's going to come up with a picture, and you're going to try to recreate it, but you got to remember it because it'll disappear. You got to know background is out of focus, foreground is out of focus, the propeller is really blurry. Okay, so now I'm going to try to recreate that image by moving the dials. I'm going to keep my 2.8 because I know that means a narrow. I'm going to move my shutter to 1/90th of a second because I really couldn't see the propeller. It almost was invisible. But now I need to move my ISO until I get good exposure. And I got a check mark. I got that one correct. Now, picture 2, it says, blur in front and behind the toy and show the propeller's movement. So, I don't want the propeller to disappear completely, but I want it to show some movement. So, once again, I'm going to keep the 2.8 because there was lots out of focus. I'm going to up my shutter speed a little bit because I want to be able to capture some of it, and I need to move my ISO up a spot to get my good exposure. And I got that one correct as well. So for this one, blur the foreground and the background and the toy around the toy plane. That's simple enough. Because just to make sure I have blur, I'm going to keep the 2.8. This one I'm actually going to move my shutter speed down and slower a little bit because I couldn't see the actual propeller. And I'm going to move my ISO down 1 to get good exposure. And I got that one correct again. Now this picture looks different. I'm going to keep the shot sharp from the foreground to the background. Right now we can actually see there's a toy car, there's a clown Jack in the Box, there's a glove, there's some pencil crayons and marbles. I can see all of it. So now I got to change things. I got to up my aperture, right? So I'm going to decrease the size of it, which means that I get more depth of field, but that means it's not as sensitive to light. And you can see my exposure meter, I am very underexposed. It would be very dark. I'm gonna even waste this one. So I'm gonna say that's all I changed. I'm gonna get this one wrong, but that's okay. Right, I moved up the aperture, but I didn't change any other setting, and I got it wrong because it was way too underexposed. Okay, so you gotta always look at all three and make adjustments. So I got that one wrong, but that's okay. So capture the movement of the propeller. Dun, dun, dun. That's gonna be doable once again, because now I can see the propeller. I'm gonna close my shutter speed down a little bit, but now I'm back to the blurry background. I'm gonna up my shutter speed. I'm gonna make sure I have good exposure, and I got that one correct. For my last one, make the propeller look still. You're gonna freeze the propeller in time, but still have blurry foreground and blurry background, which means aperture stays low. I'm gonna go pretty fast with my shutter speed because once again, I need to freeze the propeller in time. So I'm gonna go 1/1500th of a second, seems pretty good. I need to change my ISO to get good exposure, and I got that one correct. It would have taken that image. So in 1 minute and 50 seconds, I did the 6 pictures. I got the one wrong, which I knew was gonna be underexposed. And now I'm going to screenshot that, and I'm gonna post that in a discussion post. All right, good luck with messing around trying to figure out the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, because those are the 3 main things with the camera. This is a great website to practice those skills. All right, good luck, everybody.